Welcome to Stelligent's DevOps on AWS Radio, with your hosts, Paul Duvall and Brian Jakovich.
Welcome to our 20th episode of DevOps on AWS Radio. I'm Paul Duvall, CTO at Emphasis Stelligent. With DevOps on AWS Radio, we get into detailed discussions about applying DevOps practices on AWS. If you're interested in being a part of our team, we are hiring. You can go to stelligent.com/careers for more information and also to apply. In this episode, we'll get a brief preview of next month's podcast, in which I have a discussion with Casey Lee, and he gives some updates on some of the new features that have come out with Mu. If you're not familiar, Mu is an open source framework you can find on GitHub, and it's a DevOps on AWS framework that allows you to, through code, provision environments and services and pipelines in a declarative domain-specific language. And so he's going to be our guest, as I mentioned, next episode, which should be coming out in December. And he's going to be talking everything and anything about containers. So we're going to be skipping DevOps on AWS news this month. We're going to be getting a lot of that information. We'll be able to share some of what we found interesting at reInvent, which at the time of this recording is going to be starting in 10 days in Las Vegas. So in this episode, we're going to be talking with James Martin, who's an automation engineering manager at 3M Health Information Systems. So let's get started with the preview with Casey. So what is new in Mu? Maybe if you can talk about what Mu is. I know we had another podcast probably a year or so ago now that we talked about that, but is there anything related to EKS or ECS in there?
Yeah, so Refresher Mu is a open source project that we've built at Stelligent. It's all about doing DevOps on AWS. It's a command line tool that takes all of these opinions that we tend to have at Stelligent and bakes them into a bunch of CloudFormation templates, and then Mu provides an easy way to take those opinions and run them as CloudFormation stacks in your account. And so there's been a few recent announcements with Mu. First was there was support for service discovery when ECS and Route 53 got service discovery working. We adopted that inside of Mu, and so now when services are provisioned, Mu automatically configures the ECS service discovery name for each service. And then that work was also shared with ECSworkshop.com. This is a workshop that Brent Langston, AWS developer advocate, created and has been using to share and teach people how to use ECS, and they use Mu in that workshop. And so we worked with him to also revise that workshop to leverage service discovery and SRV DNS lookups using that new version of Mu. Another recent change with Mu was added support for EKS. So now, let's see, the supported environments that Mu can support, the first one was ECS. That's still supported. ECS Fargate, so you can support either ECS with EC2 launch types or ECS with Fargate. We then added EC2 for like hey, I don't want to use containers yet. Let's just use traditional EC2 instances and autoscaling groups and code deploy. But then now with EKS as a supported provider, you can provision the Kubernetes cluster through EKS. It will configure the autoscaling group for all of the Kubernetes nodes that actually run your workload. It'll configure RBAC inside the EKS cluster, and it'll do all the IAM bindings from the IAM resources into the RBAC principles inside Kubernetes. Configures an Nginx ingress service, and then it's got support for deploying Mu services as pods and services with an ingress inside of Kubernetes. And there's some work in the immediate pipeline that relates to EKS on Mu, specifically support for HPA and cluster autoscaling, and also support for kube2 IAM so that you can have individual pods running with different IAM roles. And then the most recent announcement just this week from Mu was that there's now support for service catalog. So AWS Service Catalog allows folks to register CloudFormation templates as products so that other users in the account can provision those products self-service, but then those products are provisioned in a way that aligns with whatever compliance and governance standards an organization has. So now with Service Catalog support in Mu, you can define pipeline templates. Here's the list of pipelines we want to support at our organization. Define those all out. Mu will register those for you with AWS Service Catalog, and then you have the option of either using AWS Service Catalog directly to provision those pipelines, or you could use Mu to talk to Service Catalog and provision those pipelines for the app teams. So a lot of different exciting stuff going on there.
Yeah, this has probably been over a year or so, but it also provides support for Fargate as well, right?
That's right. Yes. So you can run ECS with EC2 launch types or with Fargate. So quick ability to spin up. Which reminds me, there was also a recent change with support for RDS serverless, which is a fantastic service, especially for like a dev test environment. If you're familiar with RDS, it could take like 10 minutes to get a new RDS cluster set up. With RDS serverless, it's less than a minute. You've got an RDS endpoint that you can start using, run your test against it, and tear it down. So you're only paying for that short period of utilization, very quick spin up, spin down. So RDS serverless was also added to Mu in a recent release.
Now, is that specific to Aurora serverless, or is it multiple RDS providers?
That's right. Yeah, I'm sorry. Aurora serverless. That's the only engine that works with serverless model is the Aurora engine.
Okay, I was getting a little excited about the...
Sorry. Yeah, no Oracle serverless yet.
So last thing I want to talk about is reInvent. So we have... I think it was 50 people from Stelligent going to...
Yeah, we got an army.
Yep. So definitely looking forward to that. What are you most excited about?
I love getting out there and seeing our customers. It's a chance to see everybody all at once, get to hear stories about what people are doing with AWS, get to hear what people's plans are. It's a great opportunity to just get a pulse for where things are headed. There's so much energy there. There's, of course, there's all the announcements that are going to come on Wednesday and Thursday, always looking for what the early Christmas presents are that we'll get. But yeah, just looking forward to seeing everybody and hearing what everybody's up to.
Okay, so next up, I have a really interesting conversation with James Martin from 3M HIS. And as I mentioned, he's the automation engineering manager for that division. And we talk about all things DevOps and all things AWS in terms of which services they're using, their overall philosophy in terms of choosing services and the sort of the solution architecture that they've employed at 3M HIS. So we talk about also the structure of the teams, how they deliver their services to the individual product teams, and they talk about this concept of using a pipeline factory, using AWS Service Catalog and things like that. Go over some lessons learned, and so I think you're going to get a lot from my discussion with James Martin from 3M HIS. Okay, James, thanks for joining the podcast. So if you could start off and just talk a little bit about your background and talk about your team as well.
Sure. So name's James Martin. I am the automation engineering manager for 3M Health Information Systems. Bit about my background. I've been in this industry for over 20 years now. Started in the industry in Washington, D.C. On sort of the government federal side, working at the Pentagon, doing some help desk kind of stuff very early on in my early days. From there, I moved over into like a defense contractor, Lockheed Martin. From there, I've worked anywhere from a hosting company to back to the government at the U.S. courts. Worked at a small startup in the education space. Worked at a distributed database company called Basho. I've led the consulting team at Ansible, who was then bought by Red Hat. And I stayed at Red Hat for a little bit after the acquisition, and it came to 3M. So I've done, everything from low-level help desk grunt work to systems operations to writing automation code. And worked in various different industries and companies of all kinds of shapes and sizes. I feel like one of the things I can bring to the table is having that exposure to so many diverse kinds of companies and cultures and processes. A lot of companies kind of feel like they are unique and unicorns because they don't really have that exposure. And so it's really nice to bring that perspective into places and tell them how there actually are better ways of doing things, and no, you're not as unique as you think they are, and your problems can be solved.
So you're kind of like a consultant, but not a consultant.
Yeah, I think that consulting background is a really good skill to have for at some point in any person in the IT industry's career. It gives you so much perspective on how people are doing things and the types of problems and patterns they run into. Your antennas go straight up when you start seeing that happen at different organizations. So yeah, I feel like it almost feels like a resident consultant, but you're really in for the long term here at my current job at 3M. And I've been here for 2 years, and I try to pick up and influence and let the folks here know the things that maybe we should be trying out and doing and using new tools and changing process and measuring certain things just based on what I've seen in the past that works outside of the organization. So yeah, I think it's a really good thing to have.
So let's get into what are you doing at 3M now, and maybe talk a little bit about your team as well.
Sure. So what was hired in September 2016. From at that point, 3M had just made a big push to start moving a lot of their resources into Amazon Web Services. I think that started about a year prior to that. And this is the 3M HIS division. So just back up a little bit. There's 3M, the big 3M company that makes Post-it notes and Scotch tape and Filtrete products that you probably have in your HVAC unit. But there's also this kind of an anomalous software division in 3M. 3M Healthcare Information Systems. We are the only division in 3M that makes software products as our only source of revenue. There's other divisions of 3M create software in support of the various products, but we only create software. So we're kind of unique to that. But back to the AWS journey. So we had many different disparate data centers. We saw a need to move out of those data centers in terms to save cost, to be able to scale, et cetera. So they had this big push to consolidate into AWS. That didn't solve all of our problems, right? It did solve our problems around cost and scalability, but we still had this reliance on a central operations team to be able to push releases of software to production. So there's a bit of a bottleneck there. And so the vision that was conceived really was, let's try to figure out how to put some of that control back into the hands of the application development teams, make them more autonomous, remove bottlenecks from delivering software, and ultimately, produce better software faster, because ultimately you're getting your software into the hands of your customers faster and getting feedback faster and making improvements faster and really tightening up that feedback loop. So we created a tool called the Pipeline Factory. And the idea behind the Pipeline Factory was that, given all sorts of rules and regulations we have, with the kind of data we deal with, we need to stand up a pipeline that is compliant with those rules and regulations. Not something typically you would necessarily want a development team to say, hey, go ahead and build a pipeline completely on your own. It's just a little bit too scary because of the data that you're dealing with. So we sort of take a best practices approach around the pipelines that we're building, and doing so in an automatic way. So think of it as a meta factory. It's a factory that builds a pipeline that ultimately builds some tools, but within that pipeline are all sorts of controls and precautions to make sure that we're doing things the way that we're supposed to. And once those pipelines are in the hands of the teams, they're responsible for their code, their infrastructure as code, and their application code. They're responsible for committing their code and writing their tests, and ultimately their release manager or their product owner is responsible for releasing their product to the production account without the interaction of a central operations team.
So they own the end-to-end lifecycle, each of these teams.
That's right. Yep. Each, we have about 60 different Scrum teams, but not all of them are using this Pipeline Factory. Many of them are. I think we have well over 100 pipelines at this point. Each team has a Scrum Master, product owner, 2 pizza box kind of teams. And they're responsible end to end for their application code, as well as their infrastructure as code, and as well as their actual deployment code. One of the things that we had to teach teams when we're moving to this model was your infrastructure as code and your application delivery code, the thing that actually sets up your application, is really just as important as the core of your application itself. Like those 3 things combined really define what your application is. Gone are the days of bundle a jar and throw it over the fence to the ops team to figure out. Like the only way we found that people actually write reliable code and write reliable software delivery code, like installation code for the products, is if they're in charge of it themselves, right? If they're the ones getting the page in the middle of the night, they're ultimately going to produce products that are in installation routines of those products that are more resilient to failure, because nobody wants to get called in the middle of the night.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah. And so would you say, do each of these teams have some kind of operations type person, people writing the infrastructure as code and maintaining that, or or do they kind of switch it across team members?
Yes, it depends on the team. We have so many different teams and various backgrounds. So you will see some teams who are adopting our pipeline factory and picking it up right out of the gate. They may have had years of AWS experience prior, and everyone is AWS savvy. Or you might have a team where there's one person who really is kind of the knowledge leader in around the AWS space and is taking the ownership of the infrastructure as code and the pipelines and sort of building that, and then sort of feeds it into the other teams. You never want team members to be bottlenecks inside the team either. And I guess in the other scenarios, when you have a completely green team who hasn't had any CI/CD experience or AWS experience, those are the teams that are obviously the most challenging when working with this concept of pipelines and CI/CD. So in those cases, what we found really effective was to have a member of what we called our onboarding team to sit with that team, participate in their sprints, and really help them adopt the tooling and the procedures and the process to build their software and deploy it via their pipelines.
So these onboarding type of engineers or consultants, they are there. You said they're part of the sprints. So are they committing code as well?
Yeah, they would be responsible for committing code. What you don't want them to do is be sitting in the corner and just chucking and building all the automation for the team and say, here you go. Right. It needs to be a little bit more participatory, or else you're going to have this problem of your onboarding team just throwing code over the fence to the development team, and they're going to say, I don't have any idea what this does. So, they're not doing all of the work. They're certainly helping set the direction of the work that needs to get done and participating in completing that work as well.
So I assume it varies, but is there a typical engagement duration for one of these onboarding engineers?
Yeah, I would say if you are committing a full-time resource into a team, we've seen it take, a month or two. We've pulled back from committing the full-time resources and we're doing smaller sort of bootstrap things these days, just because the knowledge of the teams has increased. So in those cases, we're kind of just doing, check-ins twice a week for an hour or two and checking in on the progress of the teams to make sure that everything's covered and they don't need anything from us. And we found that that's worked pretty well now as the teams have matured.
Okay. So it sounds like it's a combination of self-service and then some hands-on activity for a month or two in some cases, and it's lessened over the time.
Right, and the team have the capability of doing 100% themselves. We've just found that when teams are starting completely fresh, they need a nudge in the right direction.
Got it. Okay, so when your team needs to send out a new version of this. Of a deployment pipeline based on this factory, how do you go about doing that? And how do the teams consume it?
Yeah, right. So everything we do right now is based in Service Catalog. So when we rev our pipeline factory, there's a couple of different components that get registered into Service Catalog. And the way that what I call my customers, the rest of the software development teams, would consume those new versions is they would go through the Service Catalog update process to update their relative CloudFormation stacks. So right at this point, we kind of act as a a central provisioner for those stacks just because historical reasons we weren't quite ready to open up the floodgates for every team to provision their own pipelines. We're still pushing the update process manually to those individuals as well, although just because a lot of people on the team are still relatively new to this process, and we don't want an update process necessarily to result in some sort of outage. So we've been guiding teams through the update process, but we've made that whole update process more resilient lately. And we've actually just this week talked about adding some backlog items around how we can make teams rerunning their pipeline factories as seamless as possible and really not be scared of any sorts of consequences, right? So we want to make updating a pipeline and the components around the pipeline as easy as updating an app on your phone, right? So that's the ultimate goal.
So you mentioned AWS Service Catalog, and so that's a service from AWS. And so you spoke about at reInvent 2017 about this a bit, but it's providing you the self-service capability and the governance capability. Maybe you can go into Service Catalog a bit more.
Yeah, so the way that Service Catalog is intended for most organizations is that you'll set up a catalog item that's references a CloudFormation stack that allows a user to provision something they typically wouldn't have access to do so otherwise. You can kind of create unique catalog items for all different kinds of things. You could have S3 buckets or KMS keys or EC2 instances or clusters or whatever. You can also combine those service catalog items into sort of a cohesive unit that you can also provision through Service Catalog. And most people would set those up for end users and say, hey, here's a service catalog for entry for a pipeline or an S3 bucket or whatever these resources you want to provision with Service Catalog, and would give access to their development team to go do it. We're in a little bit more tightly regulated space than a lot of industries, so we proceed with a lot more caution. So right now, we use Service Catalog as the provisioning mechanism internally for our team until we have enough confidence in the rest of the development organization. Then we would be turning it over to them to do self-servicing.
So when we were talking earlier, you have what I refer to as a serviceful kind of philosophy when it comes to the architecture. With AWS, can you get into maybe some of the services and also your approach that you have employed at 3M HIS?
Yeah, so one of the things from the get-go we talked about was use a native Amazon service whenever possible. Obviously, Amazon has a ton of services. There's also a lot of services that aren't Amazon-based that are sometimes more featureful, but with those non-native Amazon services come with a lot of overhead, right? You have to build it, you have to install it, you have to maintain it, you have to ensure that it's up and it's highly available. A lot of this stuff requires people time, which when you have a small team, you really can't afford those kinds of setups. So whenever possible, we're looking at how can we leverage Amazon native services? Does this Amazon native service do the job that we're trying to achieve? So just to run on down the list of Amazon services, we're using CloudFormation, CloudWatch, Code Build, Code Commit, Code Deploy, Code Pipeline, DynamoDB, obviously using some EC2, just getting started with ECR, ECS, IAM, KMS, Lambdas, Route 53, S3, SES, SNS, and SSM. So things like code commit. Yeah, there's GitHub is out there, GitHub Enterprise is out there. We found that code commit, while not quite as featureful as those other main competitors, it does offer a very stable platform that doesn't go down and doesn't cost us nearly anything. You could probably say the same thing. CloudFormation. Yes, you could go. You could use Terraform. We're not really doing multi-cloud stuff, so we didn't see where the benefit for Terraform was. So we felt that CloudFormation, we have a support contract with Amazon. CloudFormation supports all of Amazon services that we need. We're sticking with CloudFormation in that particular case. Code Pipeline as well is one of those things you could very easily go outside of the Amazon realm and use a different service. But we found that while it doesn't have necessarily all the features that we'd like, it's missing some people would say it's missing features like conditionals, and retries, some sort of kind of logic and branching that some of the more sophisticated pipeline tools. We found that in most cases it works fairly well for the team. So Code Pipeline is one of those tools we've chosen to stay inside of AWS. Now, one tool, to give an example, when we couldn't find a native tool, was our binary repository for our artifacts. Amazon does not make a nice, handy service for storing binary artifacts. I suppose you could build one out of S3 and that sort of thing, but so we had to choose an outside vendor for that kind of product.
So like a dependency management tool like Nexus and Artifactory, something like that?
Yes, exactly. Yep.
Okay, so when you have this, so you have this deployment pipeline factory, and you basically launch this on behalf of each of these product teams, and then the product teams then own it. So they get basically a skeleton pipeline, it sounds like, and I assume you have it stubbed out and things like that. Maybe you can talk about the different stages and actions that a typical pipeline goes through.
So when we provision a team's pipelines, they're getting things, when the pipeline factory provisions a team's pipeline, they're getting things like S3 buckets that support transfer of some storing and some of the necessary components to make this whole thing work. They're getting KMS keys. They're getting code commit repos. They're getting CloudFormation YAML files. And they're also getting some SSM parameter namespace. So they're getting a set of, and some IAM roles, obviously. So they're getting like just enough AWS resources to provision and build a product. And we actually, one of the things that we do is while we are provisioning the pipeline, we actually provision them a working pipeline. It's not like you're just getting this blank pipeline, right? It's actually has a kind of hello world application built into the pipeline. So you can validate that it works and you can see how it can progress through the environment. And we actually use that as one of our end-to-end tests. Is when we release a new version of our pipeline factory, we actually force it. One of our tests in our pipeline factory is to deploy the pipeline factory and then deploy an application into the pipeline factory to verify that the application itself builds successfully. So you're going to get the stages at a high level. The stages in the pipeline factory are checking for changes to your source control repositories. Then we have a build stage. And then deploy stages to the various environments. We found that teams will typically do manual gates between their deploy stages to the environments because they may not have enough assurances in their testing to go 100% automated all the way through. And expect as teams feel more confident in their test coverage, we'll see more and more teams have a more seamless and less manual gates in their pipelines as far as releasing those artifacts through the environments. Okay,
but so you have a single workflow. So all the way from source to production, even when you have those manual approvals, it sounds like that's even part of a fully automated workflow. It just stops, and then someone has to approve something. And then as soon as they approve it, then it moves on to the next stage and set of actions.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so the way we build out our permission scheme with the pipeline factory is that we can kind of separate a product team into different kinds of individuals. So you'll have things like application code committers, infrastructure as code committers. You'll have pipeline improvers, which are typically like your product owners. And you'll have kind of administrators who have a little bit elevated access. They can do things like stop and start their EC2 instances if they're debugging something. And so we want to we try to do least privilege and then also give teams the right amount of control over their resources so they can do the things they need to get done, help debug their application, and not sort of shoot themselves in the foot.
Right. Now, suppose they need to add some new actions to a particular stage and they want to make that update. How would they go about doing that without needing to change the deployment pipeline factory for everyone?
Right. So yeah, that's actually an interesting challenge that we have. So right now, a team has the ability to modify the CloudFormation source that updates their pipeline. However, as you can imagine, if we're pushing, let's say, a change to the pipeline factory, and we try to update a team, which is also going to try to update possibly their pipeline steps, you can sometimes run into merge conflicts. So we try to, when we're pushing a pipeline factory update to a team, and let's say they've diverged a bit in their pipeline for whatever reason, we can't seem to auto merge what the factory says the pipeline should be and what their repository says the factory should be. We sometimes get merge conflicts. The team they're not unresolvable, obviously, and so the team, but my team does have to step in time to time and help solve some of these merge conflicts for teams that are not quite savvy on doing it themselves.
And that sounds like the exception rather than the rule. It sounds like you put in enough action so that they can put in whatever they want to, what tasks they want to run within those actions.
Yeah, exactly. What we provide is like guidance on how we kind of think it should be done, and what to get this sort of hello world application out. When we do that for Windows applications, we have a sample app. We do that for Linux applications. We also do it for serverless, and we also do it for like a database kind of pipeline. So we have the ability to provision a pipeline that's kind of tailored to what the development team is trying to produce, and give them a workable pipeline that so they can either reverse engineer it or tailor it to their liking.
Got it. So it sounds like there's 4 distinct pipelines at the factory, or a number of different pipelines.
Yeah, at least 4. There's subsets of those as well, but those are the core level ones. Yeah.
Got it. Now, are you also kind of pre-baking certain types of patterns, like blue-green deployment patterns and things like that?
Yeah, so there are certain patterns in the release process, obviously, that 15 different teams could do 15 different ways. When we see things like blue-green switches, we want to be able to provide that capability to teams directly as part of the factory. So, and this sort of gives us a standard model on how 3MHIS does blue-green switches. And so when we get feedbacks from teams that saying, oh, I want this feature in my blue-green switch, or I want this feature, we can kind of take all those features and make them available again to all of the teams, versus having 15 teams doing 15 things 15 different ways, and all of those things kind of not being shared and isolated.
So you just talked about consistency and reliability. And you talked about also meeting with teams, from time to time. It was once a week or what have you. So how do you go about sort of the governance of ensuring that the teams are